As we think about Holy Week, I'd like to call your attention to one of the more touching stories, one of the more positive stories we find about Holy Week. It's recorded in the 26th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, beginning at verse 26. While Jesus was in Bethany, at the house of Simon the leper, a woman approached him with an alabaster jar of very expensive, fragrant oil. She poured it on his head as he was reclining. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This might have been sold for a great deal and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a noble thing for me. You will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. By putting this fragrant oil on me, she has prepared me for burial. I assured you," Jesus said, "whenever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. He lived back in the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, as it was called. His friends called him Artful Eddie. He was a slick, brilliant lawyer. He was one of Al Capone's cronies. In fact, he ran Al Capone's dog tracks. He mastered the simple techniques of fixing the race by overfeeding 7 dogs, betting on the 8th one. Wealth he had, status he had, style he had. When it came to outward surroundings, Artful Eddie lacked nothing. But then the day came. The day came when he decided to offer evidence on Al Capone. Artful Eddie decided to squeal. Artful Eddie decided he was going to give up. Why did he do it? What was his motives? Did he not know that if he squeals on Al Capone, the mob is not going to be happy? Why did he do it? I'll tell you why. He had a son. Artful Eddie had a son. And Eddie wanted his son to know there was more than these gangsters he had been hanging around with. Artful Eddie wanted to give his son a name, and he knew that giving his son a name meant he had to clear his own name. And Eddie was willing to make that sacrifice. He was willing to make that sacrifice so his son could have a clean slate. He never saw that dream come true. After he squealed, the mob did not forget. And 2 gunshot wounds silenced him forever. Well, was it worth it? Was it worth it? Did Eddie's son live up to the sacrifice his father had made for him? Boy, did he ever. But we'll get back to that in a few moments. First, let's talk about that principle. Let's talk about that principle of what Eddie does for his son. Risky love. Sacrificial love. Love that takes a chance. Love that goes out on a limb. Love that makes a statement. And love that leaves a legacy. Love which is unexpected, surprising, and stirring. You don't see love like that very often. You don't see it very often, but when you do, you never forget it. There were very few signs of that type of love the last week of Jesus' life. Most of the stories surrounding Jesus' last week are grim. Most are full of gloom and doom. But here Matthew gives us a glimpse into one of the tender moments that even that week held. Picture the scene. A bunch of close friends are surrounding Jesus. They're at the table. The city, Bethany. The house, Simon. Simon the leper. Well, that's what they used to call him, but not anymore. Now he's just Simon. We don't know when Jesus healed him. We don't know what he was like as a person before Jesus healed him, but we do know a lot about his circumstances. We know that his skin was sores. His shoulders were stooped. His hand fingerless. His arm scabbed. His back infected and draped in rags. And a tattered wrap hides all of his face except for two screaming white eyes. That was what he looked like. That was his condition. That was his predicament. Then something happened. Simon met Jesus. When? I don't know. Was Simon one of the ones healed before the Sermon on the Mount? I don't know. Was he one of the ones who were healed that day that 4,000 were healed in Bethsaida? Was Simon the one leper who came back to say thank you? Or was he just one of the nameless lepers that were healed when one of the gospel writers would make the statement, they brought their sick and he healed them all? We don't know. But we do know that he has Jesus and his disciples over for dinner. Simple act. But it must have meant a lot to Jesus. After all, the Pharisees are already clearing a cell for him on death row. It won't be long till they finger Lazarus as an accomplice. It could be that all the disciples will have their faces on wanted posters by the end of this week. When you think about that, it took nerve. It took nerve for Simon to ask a wanted man to dinner. But it took more nerve for a clean person to put his hand on a leper's. And Simon never forgot what Jesus had done. Simon never forgot how it was that Jesus had healed him. Because every time he looks down, where there had been a nub, now there's a finger. Where there had been ulcerous sores, now there was skin. Where there had been lonely hours in quarantine, now there were happy hours like this. No, Simon didn't forget, and Simon knew what it was like to stare death in the face. And he knew what it was like not to have a home, not to have a place to stay. So Simon wants Jesus to know, if he ever needs a meal, if he ever needs a place to sleep, there is at least one house in the town of Bethany where Jesus is always welcome. He's always welcome at the house of Simon. Now, before this week is over, Jesus will be in several other houses, and they won't be so welcoming. Before the week is up, Jesus will visit the house of the high priest. The high priest's house was the nicest in Jerusalem. 3 barns were in back, and there was a beautiful view of the city. But Jesus won't see the view. He'll only see the false witnesses. He'll only hear the lies. He'll only feel the slaps on his face. Later that week, Jesus will visit the house of Herod, King Herod. Elegant house. Plenty of servants. Maybe there's food and fruit and wine on the table, but Herod's not going to offer Jesus any. Instead, Herod wants a trick, a sideshow. Show me a miracle, country boy, Herod says. Before the week is over, Jesus will go to the house of Pilate. He'll have this rare opportunity to stand before the couch of the governor of all of Israel. Most people would consider it an honor, a moment they would never forget. But it won't be an honor for Jesus. It would not be an honor because it's in that house that Pilate will sentence Jesus to death. I can't help but wonder what if. I can't help but wonder what if Pilate had asked Jesus for help instead of asking the crowd what they wanted. What if Herod had asked Jesus for help? Not entertainment. What if the high priest had fallen on his face before the Lamb of God instead of having people slap the face of the Lamb of God? What if? We'll never know, because none of that happened. The mountain of prestige was too high, and the fall would have been too great. They wouldn't take the risk. But Simon did. Risky love always seizes the moment. Simon took a risk. He gave Jesus a good meal. Not much, but more than most. And when the chief priest and the soldiers slapped Jesus, maybe Jesus remembered what Simon had done, and maybe it encouraged Jesus and strengthened him for the task that was ahead of him. When Jesus remembered Simon's meal, maybe he also remembered Mary's gesture. Maybe as the soldiers were slapping his back and ripping the flesh off of his bones, maybe Jesus could even still smell the perfume. After all, it was imported. 12 ounces. Concentrated, sweet, strong enough to be on a man's clothes for days. I wonder if between the lashes, did he relive that moment? As he hugged the Roman post and braced himself for the next ripping of his back, did he remember the oil that once soothed his skin? Could he see the faces of Mary and Simon that day as the blood ran down his face? Because you see, Mary was the only one who really ever believed. When Jesus would talk about his death and how he would be killed and how he would rise, nobody really understood. But Mary did. Mary did. Because Mary had heard that tone before. And Mary had witnessed firsthand what happened when Jesus faced death. Mary remembers the words that Jesus cried out that day. Lazarus, come forth. And she remembers walking up to her brother, maybe even running up to her brother, holding his hand, hugging his neck, and looking over his shoulder at Jesus. And as the tears stream down Jesus' face, Mary sees him smile. And she remembers those words, I am the resurrection and the life. She remembered. She knew. And as she sees Jesus at dinner with Simon and the disciples and Lazarus, she sees Jesus laughing again, and I think her mind goes back to outside of that tomb that day she needed him so much. And in her mind, she says, this is the moment. This is it. And no one dares to imagine what happens next. She walks up behind Jesus. Jesus is the only one who can't see her. She has this big, expensive bottle of perfume in her hand. She breaks the seal, opens the perfume, and begins to pour it on Jesus' head. It runs down his face. It runs down his shoulder. The whole room is filled with the scent. It wasn't an impulsive act. She had to have planned it. She had to have carried that large vial of perfume from her house to Simon's. It wasn't spontaneous, but it was extravagant. Some scholars say that perfume would have been worth a year's wages. Maybe that was the only thing of value Mary had. It wasn't logical. It didn't make sense. It wasn't practical. But when? When has love ever been practical, logical, or made common sense? It wasn't practicality that fed the crowds. No, love did. It wasn't practicality or common sense that led Jesus to Jairus' house to kick all the mourners out when they've said the child is dead and raise the child. It was love. Common sense did not say, Peter, come to the water and walk on the water to meet me. Love did. Love did. I can see the looks on everybody else's face. Jesus is sitting there covered in perfume. Everybody smells it. And Matthew says that the disciples are indignant. What are you doing, Mary? That is so wasteful. That could have been sold. The poor could have been fed. Mary, why? And I love what Jesus says. Why are you bothering this woman? Leave her alone. She has done an excellent thing for me. And Jesus' message is just as powerful today as it was then. Don't miss it. There is a time for risky love. There is a time for extravagant gestures. There is a time to pour out your affection on one you love, and when that time comes, seize it. Don't miss it. Young husband's packing up his belongings. Solemn task. His heart is heavy. He never dreamed his wife would die so young. But the cancer was so sure, so quick. And at the bottom of his drawer, he finds a box. Negligee. Unworn. Still wrapped in paper. And the husband says to himself, she was always waiting for a special occasion. Always waiting. As the boy on the bicycle watches the students talk, he churns inside. the one they're making fun of, that's his little brother. He knows he should step up. He knows he should stand up for his brother. But those are his friends doing the teasing. What will they think? And because it matters what they think, he turns away and pedals home. As the husband looks in the jewelry case, he rationalizes. Sure, she would love the watch, but it's too expensive. She'll understand. She's a practical woman. I'll just get the bracelet today and I'll buy the watch someday. Someday I can take her on that cruise. Someday I'll have time to call and chat. Someday the children will understand why I'm so busy. Someday. But you know the truth, don't you? You know it before I say it. You probably could say it better than I can. Someday never happens. Someday never comes. And the price of being practical is sometimes higher than the price of being extravagant. Because you see, the rewards of risky, extravagant love are always greater than the cost. The message: go to the effort, invest the time, write the letter, make the apology, take the trip, purchase the gift. Do it. Do it. The seized opportunity will always give you joy, and the neglected one will always bring you regret. The reward was great for Simon. He was privileged to give rest to the one who made the earth. Simon's gesture will never be forgotten. Neither will Mary's. For Jesus promised, whenever this gospel is preached in the whole world, this story will be told in memory of her. Simon, Mary, examples of risky, extravagant love given at the right time. Which brings me back to the story I started with. Art Fletty, the Chicago mobster who squealed on Al Capone. Why? So his son could have a fair chance. Well, had Eddie been able to have seen his son Butch grow up, he would have been proud. He would have been proud of Butch's appointment to Annapolis. He would have been proud of the commissioning as a World War II Navy pilot. He would have been proud of his son as he read of his son downing 5 bombers in the Pacific, saving the lives of hundreds on the carrier Lexington. The name was cleared. The Congressional Medal of Honor was proof. And when people say the name O'Hare in Chicago, they don't think of gangsters. They think of aviation. And when you hear his name, you have something else to think about. Think about the undying dividends of risky love. Think about it the next time you hear it. Think about it the next time you fly into that airport named for the son of a gangster gone good. The son of Eddie O'Hare.